In the spring of 1215, the walls of Zhongdu had not fallen. The gates remained shut, the watchtowers were occupied, and armed men still patrolled the broad earthen ramparts surrounding the capital of the Jin Empire. Outside those walls, there was no great breach and no Mongol assault surging across the moat. The roads were simply empty. No wagons approached from the south, no relief army appeared beyond the fields, and no messenger brought word that help was coming. Inside the capital, the horses were disappearing. Animals once reserved for cavalry patrols and imperial processions were being led away to slaughter because there was almost nothing else left to eat. Grain had become more valuable than silver, and the people waiting outside government storehouses could see that the guards were protecting doors behind which the bins were nearly empty. The poorest had already begun to die. Those who remained alive searched markets, courtyards, and abandoned homes for anything that could be boiled, ground, or chewed. Zhongdu was one of the largest cities in northern China. A Jin census recorded more than 225,000 households in its metropolitan jurisdiction in 1207, though that figure cannot be converted neatly into the number trapped inside the walls 8 years later. The capital contained palaces, temples, workshops, markets, and arsenals, protected by massive earthen fortifications. Modern archaeologists have uncovered a section of the western wall nearly 80 feet wide at its thickest point. Yet none of that masonry could produce a single sack of grain. Beyond the walls, mounted patrols guarded the approaches. They did not need to stand shoulder to shoulder around the entire city. Whenever a relief column moved north, Mongol scouts could find it, follow its dust, and summon cavalry against the wagons. When the defenders sent men outside to gather food, those same riders could close around them and cut off the road home. Genghis Khan had found a way to defeat Zhongdu without first defeating its walls. The people trapped inside had once believed that surrender would be the worst possible outcome. Before the summer arrived, many would pray for the gates to open. They did not yet know that starvation was only the beginning. 4 years earlier, the road to Zhongdu had seemed impossible for any invader to reach. The Jin Empire controlled northern China and Manchuria, ruled tens of millions of people, and commanded far greater resources than all the tribes of Mongolia combined. Its officials collected taxes from rich agricultural districts, its armories produced crossbows and armor, and its garrisons occupied a chain of fortified cities from the steppe frontier to the Yellow River. To the men at the Jin court, the Mongols beyond the northern border were dangerous raiders, but they were not yet regarded as a force capable of bringing down an empire. By 1206, the political world beyond the Jin frontier had changed. Temujin had defeated or absorbed his principal rivals and gathered the surviving tribes into a new military order. At a great assembly, he took the title Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan, in the form most familiar to Western audiences. His authority rested on conquest, loyalty, and the expectation that the men who followed him would be rewarded. Peace on the steppe had given him an army, but maintaining that army required new enemies, new pasture, and new wealth. The Jin commanders waiting beyond the frontier possessed more soldiers, stronger fortifications, and access to enormous stores. Their problem was that those advantages were scattered. Troops guarded mountain passes, walled towns, roads, administrative centers, and imperial estates across a vast territory. Every commander feared abandoning his own position, because a Mongol column could pass through the opening and appear behind him. Genghis Khan did not need to defeat the whole Jin army at once. He needed to keep it from becoming one army. Near the approaches to Yehuling, or Wild Fox Ridge, Jin troops occupied difficult ground along the route into northern China. The passes narrowed the space available to the Mongol cavalry, and a determined defense could have forced Genghis to attack under conditions that favored the larger army. Yet the Jin command hesitated. Instead of striking while the invaders were still moving through restrictive terrain, officials attempted to negotiate and gather information. One of the men sent toward the Mongols was Shimo Ming'an, a Khitan officer serving the Jin. His assignment placed him between two worlds. The Khitans had once ruled a powerful empire of their own before the Jurchens destroyed it and founded the Jin dynasty. Many Khitan soldiers now wore Jin armor, without forgetting which people had conquered their families and taken their former position. When Shimo Ming'an reached the Mongol camp, he changed sides. He gave Genghis information about Jin positions and the condition of the army waiting ahead. A mission intended to protect the Jin defense instead exposed it. Years later, Ming'an would return to Zhongdu not as one of its defenders, but as one of the men commanding the forces sent to take it. With knowledge of the Jin deployment, the Mongols forced their way through the approaches and attacked. The surviving accounts do not allow a precise reconstruction of every formation at Yehuling, and the enormous troop totals repeated in later versions should not be treated as reliable head counts. What is clear is that the Jin army suffered a devastating defeat. Units that should have supported one another became separated. Communications broke down, and Mongol forces pressed the retreat through the mountain corridors. Messengers reached Zhongdu with reports that became worse as they moved through the imperial administration. A pass had been lost, a commander had disappeared, another garrison had closed its gates rather than risk coming out. The capital was not yet under siege, but its officials could no longer assume that the northern defences would keep Mongol horsemen away from the surrounding plain. Genghis advanced toward Zhongdu, but the city presented a problem unlike the army he had just defeated. Its massive walls were protected by towers, gates, moats, crossbowmen, and machines capable of throwing stones down upon attackers. Jin defenders could fire from elevation, while laborers repaired damage behind them. If the Mongols tried to carry the walls with ladders, the narrow points of approach would erase much of their advantage in mobility and force them into a costly struggle against prepared positions. The Mongol commanders tested the defences and withdrew. It was not a defeat, but it revealed a limitation that Genghis could not ignore. His horsemen could destroy armies in open country, yet Zhongdu could remain standing behind earth, timber, and brick. To take the capital, he would need either better siege capabilities or a way to make the defenders come out. Instead of sacrificing his warriors against the ramparts, Genghis released them into the country around the city. Columns spread through northern China, attacking settlements, seizing herds, and carrying away grain. Local officials who resisted could expect destruction. Those who surrendered might retain authority under Mongol supervision. Craftsmen and engineers were separated from other captives because their skills were useful. Each captured specialist made the next fortified town more vulnerable. The effects soon reached far beyond the places directly attacked. Farmers abandoned exposed villages and moved toward walled settlements, taking what food they could carry. Refugees crowded the gates of cities, already preparing for siege. Fields went untilled, transport animals were seized, and tax deliveries failed to arrive. The Jin government still possessed immense resources, but the system that moved those resources was being cut into isolated pieces. In the summer of 1213, the Mongols returned in greater force. Genghis divided his armies into separate columns and sent them across northern China. One force moved through Shanxi, another struck Hebei, while detachments attacked fortresses, roads, and administrative centers. The defenders could see where one Mongol column had appeared, but they could not know where it would be several days later. At Zhongdu, political violence now entered the palace itself. Hushahu, a Jin general whose military record had not protected him from criticism, turned his troops against Emperor Wanyan Yongji. The emperor was killed, and Wanyan Shun was placed on the throne as Emperor Xuanzong. While Mongol riders swept through the provinces, the ruler of the Jin Empire had been murdered by one of his own commanders. Outside Zhongdu, the Mongol advance continued. By the end of 1213, much of the surrounding territory had been overrun or rendered unable to support a coordinated defense. Several major cities still resisted, but they had become islands, separated by roads that Mongol cavalry could reach. Genghis Khan did not hold every field or village. He did not need to. He controlled enough movement to decide which cities received help and which were left alone. As winter passed into 1214, reports arriving at Xuanzong's court revealed the scale of his danger. The Mongols had not merely returned to the capital, they had stripped away much of the territory that made the capital sustainable. Zhongdu could resist an assault, but a long siege would require open roads, functioning granaries, loyal provincial armies, and a government capable of coordinating them. Each of those supports had already been damaged. Genghis Khan brought his forces toward the city again in the spring. Mounted troops appeared across the surrounding plain, while captured engineers and surrendered soldiers accompanied an army more experienced in siege warfare than it had been 3 years earlier. The gates closed, civilians were brought inside, and defenders took positions along the towers. Zhongdu prepared for the attack that everyone expected. The attack did not come in the form they feared. Mongol forces tightened their grip on the roads and surrounding settlements, while the capital consumed its reserves. Genghis could afford to wait longer than Xuanzong could. Even so, the besiegers faced their own limits. Disease spread among the troops, horses required vast quantities of grazing, and maintaining a large force near the city became increasingly difficult as the region was stripped of supplies. Envoys began moving between the city and the Mongol camp. The terms demanded by Genghis were humiliating: gold, silver, silk, horses, servants, and a woman of the Jin imperial house. Xuanzong's advisors understood what acceptance would mean. The emperor of the Jin would effectively acknowledge the ruler of the Mongols as his superior, paying for the privilege of remaining inside his own capital. Treasure passed through the gates that Mongol weapons had failed to open. Carts carried precious metals and silk into the enemy camp. Horses were handed over, and men and women were included among the payment. Princess Chiguo, a daughter of the murdered Wanyan Yongji, was given to Genghis Khan. Her family's political defeat became her personal fate. For the moment, the bargain worked. Genghis accepted the submission and ordered his forces to withdraw. The Mongol columns turned north, carrying wealth taken without having conquered the city, and the people watching from Zhongdu's walls saw the camps begin to empty. The capital had survived. Li Ying saw something else. The retreating Mongols were burdened by treasure, animals, captives, and the accumulated spoils of their campaign. He urged the emperor to let him attack while their movement was slowed. A successful blow might recover the tribute, restore Jin confidence, and punish an enemy moving away from its strongest position. Xuanzong refused permission. The agreement had bought peace, and an attack could bring the Mongols back before the capital had recovered. Li Ying obeyed, while the moment passed down the northern roads with Genghis Khan's baggage train. On June 27, 1214, the gates of Zhongdu opened for the imperial court. Carriages carrying members of the royal family rolled south beneath armed escort, followed by officials, servants, guards, and wagons loaded with whatever the government considered too valuable to leave behind. Residents gathered along the route and watched the procession pass. Only weeks earlier, their possessions and relatives had been surrendered to persuade Genghis Khan to spare the capital. Now the emperor they had protected was leaving it. Several officials had warned him what the departure would look like. Genghis Khan had accepted tribute and withdrawn on the understanding that the Jin ruler remained in Zhongdu as a submissive sovereign. If Xuanzong moved south, the Mongols could conclude that he had used the peace only to escape encirclement and rebuild his strength elsewhere. The emperor also risked losing the loyalty of the people he left behind. Those arguments failed against the fear of another siege, and the procession continued toward the crossing at Lugo. Among the troops assigned to the movement were Khitan soldiers, whose loyalty had already been strained by years of Jin defeats. Their people had ruled northern China before the Jurchens destroyed the Liao dynasty, and many now saw Genghis Khan supporting Khitan leaders against their former conquerors. Near the crossing at Lugo, part of the escort rebelled and eventually went over to the Mongols. Defecting troops soon threatened the bridge and the southern approach to Zhongdu. The revolt transformed Xuanzong's journey into a strategic disaster. Zhongdu's most important route to the south was now threatened by soldiers who knew Jin formations, passwords, roads, and supply procedures. News of the mutiny traveled faster than the imperial procession. By the time the emperor reached Kaifeng nearly 2 months later, Genghis Khan had been given both a reason to renew the war and an opening through which to do it. From the Mongol perspective, the meaning of the capital transfer was clear enough. Xuanzong had paid for peace while trapped, then moved his court beyond the Yellow River as soon as the pressure eased. Whether the relocation technically violated every term of the agreement mattered less than what it suggested. The Jin government intended to escape submission, reorganize its armies, and continue the struggle from a safer base. Genghis Khan ordered the campaign resumed. The Mongol columns moved back toward Zhongdu in the second half of 1214. Rather than concentrate immediately against the strongest walls, they secured approaches, attacked remaining positions around the capital, and cooperated with forces that had broken from Jin control. Lugo and the southern routes received particular attention because those roads offered Zhongdu its best chance of receiving food. By autumn, the capital was again being enclosed, but this time the imperial court was no longer inside it. Xuanzong had left 2 senior men to hold the city. Wanyan Chenghui represented the civil government and carried the burden of maintaining imperial authority after the emperor's departure. Moranjinzong commanded the military defense. Between them stood a capital crowded with officials, soldiers, artisans, merchants, refugees, and families who had watched the government remove itself to safety. Rather than throw men against the strongest walls, the Mongols spread the fighting across the roads. Their scouts watched the routes from Zhending, Zhongshan, and the districts farther south. A relief column could not move quickly because its wagons carried grain, fodder, weapons, and other supplies that Zhongdu desperately needed. Oxen and draft horses slowed on damaged roads, while the soldiers guarding them had to remain close enough to prevent raiders from reaching the cargo. The Mongols could choose where and when to attack. Mounted archers approached in loose formations, shot into the escorts, and withdrew when Jin cavalry tried to catch them. If the guards remained around the wagons, the horsemen could continue the harassment and wait for stragglers. If the guards pursued, another group could strike the exposed convoy. The purpose was not always to destroy the relief army. Burning its grain was enough to turn the entire operation into a failure. Inside Zhongdu, officials tried to control consumption before panic emptied the markets. Grain reserves had to support the garrison first, but soldiers could not defend walls while their families starved. Merchants who held private supplies faced confiscation, while those suspected of hiding food could be punished. Every attempt to preserve the stores deepened resentment among residents, who saw officials receive rations unavailable to ordinary households. The Jin court began collecting an army from several regions. Yongxi was ordered to bring men from Zhongding and Zhongshan. Wugalun Qingshou received a force recorded as including 18,000 imperial guards, along with additional infantry and cavalry approaching from the southwest. Thousands more were drawn from Hebei, while Li Ying became involved in protecting the supplies intended for the capital. On paper, the response looked substantial. In the field, these forces approached from different places, moved at different speeds, and operated under commanders who did not always trust one another. To break the siege, they had to concentrate close enough to challenge the Mongols, while also protecting a long and vulnerable supply train. If one column arrived early, it risked being attacked alone. If it waited for the others, Zhongdu consumed more of its remaining food. The defenders could see little of this struggle. Men on the southern towers scanned the horizon for signal fires or dust from approaching troops, but distance concealed whether a cloud marked a relief column, Mongol cavalry, or civilians fleeing another district. Rumors reached the city through scattered messengers. One report promised that imperial guards were only days away. Another claimed that a column had been defeated. Neither could immediately be confirmed. The siege also began breaking the garrison from within. One of Moran Jinzhong's subordinates, Pucha Qijin, surrendered to the Mongols with the troops under his control, depriving Zhongdu of trained defenders while giving the enemy another organized force familiar with the city's military system. The defection demonstrated that the walls could not protect Zhongdu from decisions made by the men standing on them. The relief operation from the south failed to restore the situation. The surviving accounts do not provide a reliable hour-by-hour reconstruction of every engagement, but the outcome is unmistakable. The reinforcements did not break through in sufficient strength, and the supplies did not reach Zhongdu in quantities capable of sustaining it. Some formations were defeated or scattered, while others could not force their way through the Mongol-controlled approaches. The capital remained sealed from the resources gathered to save it. When that news reached the city, the meaning could be seen in the markets before any official proclamation was made. Grain sellers raised prices again, or closed their shops entirely. Government agents searched warehouses and private homes for hidden reserves. Families that had once traded silver for millet began trading clothing, tools, and household goods for scraps of food. The garrison started consuming animals that had previously been protected for military use. Cavalry horses represented mobility, communication, and the ability to strike beyond the gates, but keeping them alive required grain and fodder the defenders could no longer spare. Once those horses were slaughtered, the meat fed soldiers for a limited time, while the defense lost another part of its ability to operate outside the walls. Hunger was not merely killing people, it was dismantling the garrison one weapon at a time. Refugees suffered first, because many had arrived with little food and no place in the official distribution system. They crowded into alleys, temples, abandoned structures, and the homes of relatives who were scarcely better supplied. Exposure and disease followed malnutrition. As deaths increased, the labor needed to remove bodies and maintain sanitation began to fail. Winter gave way to the early months of 1215 without bringing relief. The defenders had endured cold, shortages, and political uncertainty, but the coming spring offered no new harvest within their reach. Fields outside the city could not feed anyone behind the walls, even if farmers had been able to plant them. Mongol patrols still held the roads, and the Jin court remained far to the south. Moran Jinzhong could measure the weakening defense through his daily reports. Fewer horses remained for patrols, more soldiers appeared unfit for duty, and desertions continued despite the danger of crossing the lines. He could order stricter rationing, punish theft, and reinforce the gates, but none of those measures brought food closer. His authority depended on the expectation that endurance would eventually produce rescue, and that expectation was disappearing. Wanyan Chenghui faced a different form of collapse. He had been left to represent an emperor whose absence now shaped every argument within the city. If he surrendered, he would betray the dynasty and place the population at the mercy of men who had devastated the northern provinces. If he continued resisting, thousands more would starve while the emperor remained beyond the Yellow River. Outside, the Mongols waited for those choices to destroy the defense from within. They had suffered losses and illness during the war, and some units had traveled enormous distances, but they no longer needed to climb Zhongdu's walls. Every failed convoy, every slaughtered horse, and every defection accomplished what a siege engine could not. By the spring of 1215, the capital remained outwardly imposing. Its towers still rose above the plain, banners still moved along the parapets, and guards continued closing the gates at night as they had before the war. Behind them, the food had nearly vanished, the relief army had failed, and the chain of command was beginning to break. The walls of Zhongdu had stopped the Mongols from entering. They could no longer stop the people inside from dying. Within Zhongdu, refugees moved again, this time from poorer outer districts toward temples, markets, and neighborhoods where they believed food remained. Their arrival increased pressure on residents who had once opened their doors to relatives from the countryside. Families began hiding whatever they possessed, afraid not only of government searches but of neighbors driven past restraint. The markets gradually ceased to function as markets. Goods remained on abandoned stalls, but grain and meat could no longer be obtained through ordinary trade. A merchant with a hidden store faced an impossible choice: sell it and attract a desperate crowd, surrender it to officials, or conceal it and risk severe punishment if discovered. Theft rose because the law offered no answer to people whose children had not eaten. Disease followed hunger into the crowded streets. Malnourished residents lacked the strength to resist infection, while the systems that removed waste and buried the dead began to fail. Laborers assigned to sanitation weakened or disappeared. Bodies remained longer in homes and alleys, and each delay increased the danger to the living. Wanyan Chenghui tried to preserve the institutions of the capital as those institutions lost their power. He represented the Jin court, received petitions, supervised officials, and carried the emperor's authority in a city from which the emperor had removed himself. Each day forced him to defend decisions made in distant Kaifeng to people who suffered their consequences in Zhongdu. No explanation could erase what the residents had seen. Xuanzong's carriages had passed through the southern gate before the blockade closed. The royal family, court officials, and imperial treasure had been carried towards safety, leaving others to guard the empty seat of government. The capital retained its palaces and ceremonial halls, but the court that gave those buildings meaning was gone. Shimo Mingan offered the defectors something the Jin government could no longer guarantee: a place in the force that was winning. As a former Jin officer and a Ken serving Genghis Khan, he demonstrated that surrender did not always mean execution. Men with useful knowledge or trained soldiers under their authority might be accepted, rewarded, and ordered to fight their former comrades. That possibility attacked the city more effectively than threats alone. A commander considering defection could tell himself that he was preserving his men rather than betraying them. An officer who remained loyal could no longer be certain that the unit beside him would make the same choice. Each rumor of secret negotiation forced Moran Jinzong to divide his attention between the enemy outside and the garrison within. The military commander's own position became increasingly dangerous. If Zhongdu fell, he might be blamed for surrendering the old capital. If he resisted until the population died, he might still be abandoned by the emperor who had placed him there. The departure of his subordinate Pucha Chijin showed how little control he retained, and every failed relief attempt reduced the value of continued loyalty. As the weeks passed, Moran began preparing a way out. The surviving accounts do not preserve a complete record of his discussions or the exact route of his escape. What is clear is that he eventually left Zhongdu with members of his family and fled toward Kaifeng. The man responsible for the city's military defense chose to save himself before the gates opened. His disappearance could not be concealed for long. Officers arrived for orders and discovered that the commander who had demanded endurance was gone. Units on the walls learned that their highest military superior had taken his relatives south while they remained trapped. Any remaining belief that a coherent plan existed inside Zhongdu suffered a blow from which it could not recover. Wanyan Chenghui was left with responsibility, but no means of fulfilling it. The army's command structure had fractured. The population was starving, and the court remained beyond the Yellow River. He could try to organize a defense under new officers, yet their men were hungry and their loyalty uncertain. He could seek terms, but he had no assurance the Mongols would honor them after months of resistance. For Wanyan Chenghui, flight carried another burden. He belonged to the Wanyan imperial clan and had been entrusted with the former capital. If he followed Moran Jinzhong south, he would arrive before the emperor as the official who had abandoned Zhongdu. Unlike the soldiers who might disappear among refugees, his name and office made escape from responsibility impossible. He chose death. The precise details do not survive with enough certainty to reconstruct his final hours, but the consequence is clear. The senior civilian authority in Zhongdu took his own life as the city's defenses collapsed. One commander had fled, another had surrendered, and the official who remained loyal was dead. At the same time, hunger reached depths that later chroniclers struggled to describe without horror. Animals that would never normally be eaten had already disappeared. Leather and other materials could be boiled in attempts to extract nourishment. The weakest residents died first, but continued scarcity eventually reached households that had entered the siege with money, servants, and private stores. Several historical traditions report that some inhabitants resorted to cannibalism. The scale cannot be established, and later writers often use such reports to express the extremity of a siege. Yet there is no reason to doubt that Zhongdu had reached a level of starvation where ordinary social boundaries were breaking down. The capital that had once displayed the wealth of northern China had become a place where survival itself carried shame. The Mongols did not need to witness every consequence to know that their method was working. Defectors brought information about the remaining grain, the condition of the garrison, and disputes among officers. Captured messengers carried letters that revealed how urgently the city appealed for help. Smoke from cooking fires diminished as fuel and food disappeared, while fewer defenders could be seen moving along some sections of wall. Samuka could maintain the blockade and let the crisis continue, but the besiegers also wanted the city's wealth before it was consumed, hidden, or destroyed. A completely dead capital offered less plunder, fewer skilled captives, and fewer supplies than a surrendering one. Once reports indicated that command had collapsed, pressure on the gates and negotiations could intensify without requiring a costly general storm. For the remaining Jin officers, opening the city promised no safe outcome. Mongol armies had destroyed settlements that resisted and sometimes killed populations after capture. The defenders could hope that surrender before an assault might preserve lives, but no one could guarantee the behavior of thousands of victorious warriors entering one of the richest cities they had ever seen. Keeping the gates closed offered only a more certain death. The relief armies had failed, the emperor was not returning, and the last stores could not sustain the population. Even if the walls held through the summer, there would be no harvest available inside them. Continued resistance no longer served a military objective. It merely determined how many people would still be alive when the end came. Groups within the city began acting independently. Some officers sought contact with the besiegers, while civilians gathered near gates and government buildings demanding food or surrender. Guards who had once dispersed crowds faced people too weak to fight, but too desperate to leave. Every disturbance pulled soldiers away from the ramparts and made another district harder to control. The palace compounds offered a visible reminder of everything that had been lost. Rooms built for the emperor stood empty, their officials gone or reduced to guarding objects no government could use. Storehouses and workshops were searched repeatedly because residents believed imperial wealth must include hidden food. Gold, silk, and ceremonial treasures still existed, but none could be carried through the Mongol lines and exchanged for grain. Outside those compounds, the dead accumulated. Later accounts of the fall would emphasize the enormous loss of life, though no reliable casualty total survives. Starvation, disease, violence, exposure, and the eventual sack became inseparable in memory. For those inside during the final days, the distinction mattered little. Every street carried evidence that the capital was dying before the enemy entered it. Near the end of May, resistance had been reduced to isolated decisions at individual gates and posts. One officer might insist on holding his sector, while another prepared to surrender. Soldiers who had guarded the same wall for months no longer knew whether the men at the next tower would fight, flee, or open a passage during the night. The Mongols waited close enough to exploit whichever choice came first. At the end of May 1215, usually dated May 31st, though some modern accounts give June 1, the defense of Zhongdu ended. Sources differ on the exact mechanics of the final entry, and the evidence does not support a spectacular breach led personally by Genghis Khan. After the city's leadership disintegrated, Mongol troops captured the gates or passed through positions that defenders could no longer hold. The result is clear, even if the final sequence is not. The first troops entering had to move through streets filled with starving civilians and armed men whose intentions were uncertain. Some defenders laid down their weapons, hoping submission would protect them. Others may have fought in isolated pockets or tried to escape through distant gates. Mongol officers began securing entrances, arsenals, storehouses, and imperial compounds before rival groups could seize the contents. Genghis Khan himself was not riding at the head of the troops. He had entrusted the final operation to his commanders, leaving men such as Samuka and Shimo Mingan to take control of the capital. His absence did not lessen his responsibility for the strategy that had brought Zhongdu to this point, but it shaped what happened next. The conqueror who had accepted its submission the previous year was not personally present to impose immediate order on every unit entering the city. For the inhabitants, the opening of the gates may initially have felt like relief. The blockade had ended. Food, animals, and supplies existed beyond the walls, and the daily certainty of starvation was over. Those who survived could hope that surrender had purchased what resistance no longer could, another day of life. Then the soldiers began searching the houses. Warehouses were broken open, captives were separated from their families, and armed groups moved toward the wealthiest districts. Fires appeared in a city built largely from timber, where exhausted residents no longer possessed the organization or strength to stop them. Zhongdu had survived the siege until Mongol troops reached its gates. It had not survived long enough to save itself from the men waiting outside. The first Mongol units entering Zhongdu did not find a city prepared to receive conquerors. They found streets clogged by hunger, abandoned government offices, weakened soldiers, and residents who had spent months consuming everything that could keep them alive. Some gates and strategic buildings could be occupied quickly, but controlling an urban population of this scale required more than cavalry. As troops spread beyond their assigned positions, surrender began to turn into plunder. The imperial compounds offered the richest targets. Zhongdu had served as the principal capital of the Jin dynasty for more than 60 years, and wealth from across northern China had accumulated inside its walls. Even after Xuanzong removed part of the treasury and paid an enormous tribute in 1214, the city still contained silk, precious metal, weapons, ceremonial objects, fine clothing, and the possessions of wealthy families. Mongol warriors who had followed Genghis Khan across the Gobi now entered rooms containing more wealth than many had seen in their lives. Discipline became harder to enforce with each warehouse opened. Units searched palaces and government offices, while smaller groups pushed into merchant districts and private homes. Doors were forced, concealed storage spaces uncovered, and residents threatened for valuables they might still possess. People who had survived by hiding food or silver now discovered that secrecy could mark them for interrogation. The violence did not remain confined to soldiers who resisted. Civilians were killed during the seizure of buildings, the search for treasure, and the struggle over captives. Some residents attempted to escape through streets leading away from the occupied gates, only to encounter other Mongol units entering the city. Others remained inside their homes, hoping the destruction would pass around them. It did not pass quickly. Once fires began, Zhongdu's dense construction turned local destruction into a citywide threat. Much of the capital was built from timber, and its markets and storehouses contained wood, oil, cloth, and other combustible materials. Flames moved from one structure to the next, while the people who might normally have organized fire crews were starving, dead, or hiding. Some buildings may have been burned deliberately during the sack. Others caught fire as control collapsed. A cooking flame, an overturned lamp, or an attempt to force defenders out of a barricaded structure could ignite an entire block. Wind carried sparks across rooftops, and smoke narrowed visibility in streets already crowded by troops and civilians. The same walls that had trapped Zhongdu during the famine now impeded flight from the fire. Accounts written after the conquest claimed that parts of the city burned for weeks, perhaps as long as a month. The precise duration cannot be established, but the scale of destruction was unmistakable. From beyond the walls, smoke would have marked the location of a capital the Mongols had failed to take by assault, and then devastated after blockade had broken its ability to resist. Mongol officers attempted to identify people whose skills made them more valuable alive. Craftsmen, metalworkers, armorers, engineers, scribes, physicians, and administrators could serve the conquerors in future campaigns. Interpreters and defectors moved among the captives, asking questions and separating useful specialists from the larger population. For some families, a trade practiced for generations became the only protection they could offer. The defenders who survived the famine had little ability to restore order. Some discarded their armor and blended into the population, while others surrendered in organized groups. Men identified as officers could be interrogated for information about hidden weapons, treasure, or forces still loyal to the Jin. Those who continued resisting gave the conquerors a reason to kill anyone found nearby. The capture of Zhongdu produced such enormous quantities of property that simple looting could not distribute it fairly. Genghis Khan's authority depended in part on dividing the rewards of conquest among those who served him. If powerful commanders seized everything first, lesser warriors could feel cheated, while disputes between units might turn violent. The treasure therefore became a political problem as soon as it became a military prize. According to the Mongol historical tradition, Genghis Khan sent 3 trusted men, including Shigi Kutuku, an adopted member of his household, to supervise the division of goods taken from the city. 2 accepted valuable gifts from former Jin officials who hoped to influence how the property was handled. Shigi Kutuku refused, arguing that the Jin wealth already belonged to Genghis Khan and could not be offered to him as though it remained in Jin hands. The Mongol leader needed rules for property, captives, appointments, and punishment. A raiding force could divide animals and portable goods before returning to the steppe. An empire that intended to hold cities required officials capable of recording households, collecting taxes, supervising labor, and preventing commanders from consuming everything they had won. Zhongdu's destruction demonstrated both the power of Mongol warfare and the limits of governing through plunder. Among the scholars who survived the fall was Yelu Chukai, an educated Khitan whose family had served the Jin. He remained in Zhongdu for several years before Genghis Khan summoned him to the Mongol court in 1218. He was not a battlefield commander, and his value did not lie in the weapons he carried. He understood astronomy, medicine, literature, ritual, and the administrative traditions used to govern northern China. Under Genghis Khan, and especially Ögedei, Yelu Chukai became closely associated with the effort to tax and administer conquered agricultural populations instead of simply consuming their wealth. The famous idea linked to him that an empire could be conquered from horseback but not governed from horseback was shaped by later tradition rather than securely recorded as his exact words. Yet his career reflected a real transformation already visible after Zhongdu. Mongol rulers were learning that dead taxpayers and burned workshops produced no future revenue. No reliable casualty figure survives. Later claims that the entire population was exterminated cannot be reconciled with records showing inhabitants in the city and surrounding district after the conquest. Yet survival does not make the losses small. People died during the blockade, from disease inside the walls, during the fighting and plunder, and in the fires that followed. Later writers tried to express the scale through images rather than numbers. The Persian historian Juzjani recorded a story about travelers approaching the region and seeing what appeared to be a white hill. They were told it consisted of bones left from the slaughter. The tale was written after the event and cannot be treated as an eyewitness measurement, but it preserved the reputation Zhongdu acquired across Asia, a city so devastated that its dead seem to have become part of the landscape. For the Jin government in Kaifeng, the loss was both strategic and deeply personal. Xuanzong had preserved himself by moving south, but the move had helped provoke the renewed invasion and left Zhongdu politically exposed. He now ruled from a safer capital, while reports arrived describing what had happened to the people, officials, and soldiers left behind. The Jin dynasty was not destroyed in 1215. It still held rich territories south of Zhongdu, large armies, fortified cities, and the new capital at Kaifeng. Its rulers would resist for nearly 19 more years. What disappeared at Zhongdu was the possibility that the war could be contained along the old northern frontier. The Mongols now possessed a major political center inside northern China. They had access to new soldiers, engineers, officials, workshops, and intelligence networks. The capture gave them a base from which to continue operations toward the northeast, the Yellow River, and the remaining Jin strongholds. A war that had begun as an invasion from the steppe was becoming a struggle for permanent rule. For the moment, the destruction of Zhongdu overshadowed those problems. Genghis Khan had brought down one of Asia's greatest capitals without sacrificing his army in a reckless assault. He had turned geography, hunger, political division, and defection into siege weapons. The city's enormous walls had remained militarily formidable until the government behind them ceased to function. This was the central military tragedy of the siege. Xuanzong preserved the dynasty by leaving, yet his departure weakened the very defense that might have kept northern China under Jin control. Genghis Khan did not create every fracture within the empire. He identified those fractures, widened them, and positioned his forces where each failure would produce another. As the smoke thinned above Zhongdu, survivors emerged into a political world transformed around them. The emperor who had ruled from their city now lived far to the south. Soldiers who once served the Jin patrolled under Mongol commanders. Government buildings had been emptied, neighborhoods burned, and families dispersed through captivity or flight. For some residents, survival meant accepting the authority of the conquerors. Artisans returned to work under new supervisors, officials provided records, and laborers cleared passages through ruined districts. Others fled toward remaining Jin territory, carrying accounts of starvation and fire to communities that would soon face their own decision between resistance and submission. Among those stories, the strongest memory was not necessarily the moment the gates opened. It was the reversal that followed. For months, the people had believed that an end to the blockade would mean food, movement, and life. When surrender finally came, it brought armed men into homes that hunger had already stripped of protection. Zhongdu had been starved until organized resistance failed. It was plundered because victory created demands of its own. Warriors expected payment, commanders expected rewards, and the wealth of the Jin capital lay within reach. The blockade and the violence that followed were connected, but they served different purposes. One defeated the city, the other distributed the price of conquest. Beyond the ruins, the larger war continued to move. Jin banners still flew above Kaifeng, and Xuanzong still possessed armies capable of fighting. Genghis Khan had captured the old capital, but he had not yet destroyed the dynasty. Both sides now faced a new question, whether Zhongdu would become the high point of a devastating raid, or the first permanent capital taken by an empire that intended to rule China. In Kaifeng, Emperor Xuanzong continued to issue commands as though the loss of Zhongdu could be contained. The new capital still stood behind formidable defenses, the court still collected taxes from surviving provinces, and Jin armies remained in the field. Yet each report from the north showed how much authority had disappeared. Officials changed allegiance, local commanders acted without permission, and communities that once looked to the emperor for protection now negotiated with whoever controlled the nearest road. Genghis Khan did not remain permanently focused on Zhongdu. Northern China still contained resisting cities, but the Mongol Empire was expanding in other directions, and new conflicts drew his attention westward. In 1217, he entrusted much of the continuing war against the Jin to Mukhali, one of his most capable commanders. Mukhali received broad authority to campaign, accept surrenders, reward allies, and govern territory without waiting for instructions from the distant Khan. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during his final campaign against Western Shah. His death did not end the war with the Jin. The Mongol state had become larger than one man's personal following, and his successors inherited commanders, troops, administrators, and a clear claim to territories already conquered. Under Ögedei Khan, the effort to destroy the Jin resumed with greater coordination. The final campaigns forced the Jin into an increasingly narrow space. Mongol armies crossed the Yellow River and approached Kaifeng, the city Xuanzong had selected as a refuge. The same pattern that had destroyed Zhongdu began to form again. Roads were cut, surrounding territory lost, food became scarce, and refugees crowded behind defensive walls. The capital chosen to escape one siege became the target of another. Kaifeng resisted fiercely in 1232. Its defenders possessed powerful crossbows, stone-throwing machines, incendiary weapons, and gunpowder bombs that exploded among besieging troops. Disease also struck the Mongol forces, while the city's walls frustrated assault. Yet the defenders could not reverse the strategic situation beyond those walls, and famine and epidemics spread through the population. The Jin emperor eventually fled Kaifeng, repeating the decision Xuanzong had made at Zhongdu. Survival again required abandoning a capital, but there was now little territory left to receive the court. The government moved from one refuge to another, while Mongol forces and their allies closed around it. Each departure preserved the person of the emperor for a few more months and reduced the dynasty to a smaller circle of defenders. The end came at Kaizhou in 1234. The Mongols attacked alongside forces from the southern Song, whose rulers believed cooperation would help recover lands once taken by the Jin. Trapped within the city, Emperor Aizong abdicated because he did not want to be remembered as the ruler under whom the dynasty formally ended. His chosen successor reigned only briefly before Kaizhou was overwhelmed. 19 years had passed since Zhongdu fell. The Jin dynasty had survived the loss of its capital, rebuilt armies, and continued resisting across a wide front. It had not recovered from the chain of military and political failures that left Zhongdu isolated in 1215. Chaizhou completed a collapse that had become visible when Xuanzong's carriages crossed the bridge at Lugou. The southern Song gained little lasting security from helping destroy its old enemy. With the Jin removed, no powerful state remained between the Mongols and southern China. Fighting between the former allies soon followed. The conquest of the southern Song would take decades, far longer than the fall of Zhongdu, but it ended in 1279 with the Mongols controlling all of China. Zhongdu itself did not remain an empty ruin. Survivors continued living in and around the old city, and Mongol administrators used the region under the name Yanjing. Its location remained strategically valuable because it stood near the routes connecting the northern Chinese plain with the steppe. The conquerors who had devastated it could not ignore the geography that had made it a capital. Decades later, Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai chose the region as the center of his own rule. Rather than completely rebuilding the old Jin city, he constructed a new capital to its northeast. It became Dadu, the great capital, and was known to travelers from the west as Khanbalik. The political center abandoned by the Jin returned under a Mongol dynasty. The contrast was extraordinary. Genghis Khan's armies had starved Zhongdu, plundered its compounds, and burned large sections of the city. Kublai's government employed planners, artisans, engineers, and officials to build another imperial capital beside its remains. Canals carried grain toward the new metropolis, palaces rose inside carefully arranged walls, and the region once devastated by conquest became the administrative heart of the Yuan dynasty. Genghis Khan succeeded because he did not allow the strength of the walls to dictate his strategy. He attacked the roads that supplied them, the armies that might relieve them, and the loyalties that held the defense together. Hunger accomplished what repeated frontal attacks might have failed to do. By the time Mongol troops passed through the gates, the strongest fortress in northern China contained too little food, too few horses, and no unified command. But the fall of Zhongdu carried another military lesson, one darker than the effectiveness of blockade. Surrender did not automatically end the violence. Once thousands of warriors entered a wealthy capital, the expectation of plunder, the search for captives, and the collapse of urban order created a second disaster. The population survived the siege only to face looting, killing, enslavement, and fire. Later chroniclers remembered bones lying beyond the ruined city and smoke hanging above it for weeks. Their accounts may magnify details, as medieval writers often did when describing catastrophe, but they did not invent the destruction itself. Archaeology and surviving records confirm that Zhongdu was devastated and that the population was severely reduced. What had been one of the greatest cities of East Asia ceased to function as the capital it had once been. The people who endured the siege left few individual voices. We know the names of emperors, generals, defectors, and officials because governments preserved their actions. The names of families who sold everything for grain, soldiers who remained at their posts, and laborers who tried to bury the dead are mostly lost. Yet their experience formed the central reality of the campaign. They watched an enemy approach and fail to break their walls. They saw their emperor purchase peace and then leave through the southern gate. They waited for relief armies that never arrived, killed the horses meant to defend them, and survived long enough to witness their commanders surrender, flee, or die. When the gates finally opened, they discovered that the end of hunger did not mean the end of danger. Today, Zhongdu lies beneath the southwestern districts of modern Beijing. Only fragments of its foundations, waterworks, walls and gates remain visible through archaeology. Kublai's capital and later rebuilding shifted Beijing's urban center northeastward, leaving much of the Jin metropolis beneath later streets and buildings. Its disappearance can make the siege feel distant, but the decision that destroyed it remains recognizable. A ruler chose to save his government by abandoning the place his people had been ordered to defend. A conqueror chose not to waste his soldiers against walls when he could starve everyone behind them. Commanders chose loyalty, surrender, escape, or death, and each decision narrowed the choices available to those who came next. In the spring of 1215, guards still stood above Zhongdu, looking across walls no enemy had decisively breached. Below them, the storehouses were empty, and the streets were filling with the dead. The city appeared unconquered from the outside because its defenses remained in place. Inside, everything that allowed those defenses to matter had already disappeared. That was how Genghis Khan defeated Zhongdu. He did not first destroy its walls, he destroyed its connection to the world beyond them. And when Mongol troops finally passed through the gates, the people discovered that the city's fall was not the end of their ordeal. It was the moment something even worse began.